So again, I'm Jess Harris. I am one of the newer members of the Carbon Leadership Forum Seattle Hub Committee members. And we are joined today by Kathleen Petrie from King County, as well as Kjell from Element Architects. And we're today, as everyone sees, we're going to talk about embedding embodied carbon into the Washington State Building Code. And I think we're more. My expectation today is more to talk about kind of navigating the process on how these things get into code, and then how we can engage as jurisdictions, as practitioners out there for this legislation and for these code amendments. I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kjell. I know that we've had a technical difficulty today, but I think we're going to power through it. So Kjell, I'll hand it over to you, and I will stop sharing, I guess, just so that we can see you in fully. And there we go.
So Kjell Anderson, Element Architects. I've been part of the Carbon Leadership Forum Seattle Hub for a while. I'm on the State Building Code Council. I'm the architect representative to that. I see Jay Arnold, also from the Building Code Council, is here. I also lead the Energy Code Technical Advisory Group. I chair that for commercial and residential. But this year in the Building Code Council, we are looking again at embodied carbon in the codes. And so the main thing I'm going to talk about today is embodied carbon, an appendix that would be optional in the codes. So this is by no means a done deal. It's gotten through the TAG process, Technical Advisory Group process of the Building Code Council. It's also gotten through the committee process and been voted by the council into a public comment process. So we're going to talk about how to make public comments and all that in the upcoming months. So the council, the overall process for the council is let's see, where is that? This is the schedule the Code Council has followed for this cycle. The initial proposal for embodied carbon was proposed in June of 2024, so 18 months ago. The technical advisory group discussed it over, between the TAG and the committee, it's been over a dozen meetings. So for the last 18 months, it's been out in the public. Anyone can comment on it. Anyone can have an input onto it. And it's been discussed at a pretty rigorous level. Then it's going to go out for public comment. And there's been a change that I just learned about, that it won't go out for public comment until February is where it says here. It probably will be a month later than that, or March, where it'll be open for public comment, and then anyone in the world can submit a written or oral comment on it at the hearings. And then it would be implemented. It probably would be implemented in May 1 of 2027. Some of the dates on here aren't right. So there are also a couple of other things. So I think everybody knows what embodied carbon is. It's the greenhouse gases from construction materials, the creation of them, all the way through the end of life, so also the use of them. So that's what we're talking about. And right now, if you look at the state strategies, the state has a mandated goal through the legislature of a 95% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050. And so far, when you look at the climate action plan for the state, the draft of it that's out, there's almost nothing on embodied carbon. So I think we can all comment on that. So if you look up the state's climate action plan draft, there's almost nothing. There's Buy Clean, Buy Fair, but there's nothing else really about embodied carbon. And I think they need to hear from lots of people that this is an important part of the 95% greenhouse gas reduction expected by 2050, and we need the right policies to do so. How to submit comments. When the public comment period is open, you can email comments to Dustin Kerb, who's the managing director at the State Building Code Council, and they take written comments for the month or so, probably in March and early April. And then there's also going to be a hearing in person and virtual in Eastern Washington and one in Western Washington. And that's where you can show up and speak your mind, or you can show up virtually and also speak your mind. So those are the public comment pieces of it. And I think with that, I'll maybe hand it back or hand it over to Kathleen.
Thanks, Kjell. Hello, everybody. I'm going to share screen here. Is that working? Everybody see that slide? Cool, thank you. So my name is Kathleen Petrie, and I am Program Manager of Green Building Communitywide at King County, and I'm located in Solid Waste Division of DNRP, and Department of Natural Resources and Parks. And so part of my job is, well, my whole job is to expand the amount of green building done across King County and beyond. One of the ways we do this is through a group I facilitate called the Regional Code Collaboration. And we've been together a very long time, but basically it's a collection of jurisdictions working together to advance our shared climate goals. And so today, what I'm going to share with you very briefly, I'm just a small portion of this presentation today, but talk with you about how the RCC can support jurisdictions in this process associated with public comment, excuse me, pardon me, and tell you a little bit of how we work in case folks, jurisdictions would like to be a part of the larger whole. So essentially, the RCC started in 2012, and we have focused most of the time on advancing green building through regulation. And so we focused a lot on code development. My background is as a technical code writer, and so I'm going to talk about the process that we go through, but so we create a code together, and then I work with jurisdictions on adoption, excuse me, and then through RCC, we also provide trainings. It's open to any jurisdiction within or outside of King County. We've had jurisdictions from all over Washington state, primarily BC and Oregon participate, and jurisdictions kind of oscillate in and out as they are interested. We don't convene regularly, just when it's needed, and it is free. So, excuse me, so to share more about how consensus code development works is we understand the needs from jurisdictions. And so most recently it's been heat island mitigation. And essentially what I will do is I will piecemeal codes from all over the world, determine what might be the best code. I draft it, convene the jurisdictions, and by consensus, we go through the code systematically and folks provide input based on their experience. This is going to work for us. At this scale, this wouldn't make sense. And essentially we run through that process about twice. A final code is produced and I redistribute to jurisdictions with the code any research that was done technically or with respect to an equity analysis, talking points that a staff person can take to council as they're moving it through their process. And then I support in local adoption. Over the past many years, we're learning that very few jurisdictions, excuse me, really have the resources to move these codes through their own local system. And so what I do is take this consensus code and I bring it to the state. And so we'll submit it. I kind of usher it through, kind of facilitate it through, and then reconvene jurisdictions to participate in the public testimony period. And that can be sign-on letters, verbal testimony, we create talking points, things of that sort. And so what was going to be local legislation then becomes statewide, and we're continuing to advance our work. So relative to the IBC, IRC and whatnot, you're going to see elements in there relative to the allowed use of salvaged lumber, we've got EV charging, your solar ready provisions were developed through the RCC. You'll see heat island mitigation, hopefully in the IRC will be, and we've got a whole bunch of other work. This is our 2026 work plan. So we're going to be working on multifamily recycling codes that will incorporate compost at space allowance. We're going to be supporting, in general, the concept of embodied carbon. We want to see as much of that legislation go through as possible. You can see all the other various things that we do. And so if jurisdictions want to pop in, just give me a holler through email, and we'll invite you to the next round. And how we're going to support then the embodied carbon proposals, or the embodied carbon work happening at the state level now. At King County, we've been going through a bit of a transition with the transition in executives. And so we're a little bit further behind in the process that we'd like to see. But so our permitting division is only now doing the deep dive on the two pendency proposals that Kjell's going to speak to. And so we're still formulating, what we're going to do as a county, but we are supporting embodied carbon as it's going to appear in state requirement. And so on February 18th, Kjell is very kindly going to provide his time as a Q&A to building officials, sustainability staff, anybody from jurisdictions, electeds, please do join. It's an opportunity to get some of those more difficult questions answered. We can do the deeper dive. We can focus more on enforcement. And it's good for Kjell as a person on the tags to understand, really from our vantage where we might be having some challenges if there are some issues within any of the proposals. We can also look at it and compare projects. How would we apply this to a particular project? There are a lot of unique things that come through our door. And so would this legislation work in that regard? And so then what we'll do is we will create, if there's a consensus from jurisdictions that are in support of, if there's feedback we want to provide, King County will help to craft those talking points. We will also coordinate on testimony, however that is going to appear. So just wanted to provide this opportunity. Again, if you would like to participate as a jurisdiction, please do give me a contact. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Before we go back to Kjell, I neglected to talk about the ground rules, which I think everybody knows at this point. Keep yourself muted. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat, and then we should have time after the presentation for discussion and to take some questions. I think in this case, because Kjell's PowerPoint kind of blew up, we'll probably try to drop in more links into the chat. I'll be kind of trying to drop some stuff in to kind of fill in the gaps. And then after maybe the presentation's over, we can send around an actual presentation slide deck, hopefully. But anyway, Kjell, why don't you take it from here? Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk for another 10 or 15 minutes about the appendices, and I'll share my screen. But then I hope it's more of a discussion after that. All of this is in draft. It's ready for public comment. And so, yeah, I'd rather have a discussion than just talk at you, especially without a presentation. So the context is also, there is Buy Clean, Buy Fair in Washington, which is a reporting only regulation for public projects funded by the state. Reporting only, and then they can create a database of the information that they get from that. California has a Buy Clean regulation, which limits a short list of materials to certain embodied carbon limits. California also has a Title 24, which provides 3 pathways for projects to comply with embodied carbon regulations. One is a materials pathway, one is an existing buildings pathway, and another one is a whole building life cycle analysis pathway. Vancouver, BC, our neighbor to the north, also has an embodied carbon regulation. So we already have Buy Clean, Buy Fair. There are 2 other things that could impact embodied carbon in Washington right now. One is this appendix, which would go in the International Building Code with Washington amendments. So be part of not the energy code or the plumbing code or anything, but the building code. So be part of your permit package. There's also a bill, which is 2273, I believe, which was introduced last legislative cycle, got through a couple of committees, but didn't run out of time. And so that was reintroduced this year with the number 2273. Last year was 1458. 2273 has been introduced. It will probably be heard by committees at some point, and I don't know when. But can all show up and testify on that, and you can look for it right now. If you just look up HB 2273, you can see where it is, and then you can see the schedule on the legislative website for that. So that may or may not pass this year. One thing that seems, based on the council discussion, to have a decent chance of passing is the appendix for the IBC. So it's an optional appendix, meaning it's got code language in there. It also has some thresholds. Thresholds could be, embodied carbon reduction of below the median, or 10% below the median, or 10% worse than the median. The thresholds in the optional appendix could also be adopted by a jurisdiction to be buildings over 100,000 square feet, buildings over 50,000 square feet. So even the building codes, even the building code council will allow, will have jurisdictions adopt specific numbers into their into what they adopt as their local IBC code that they're going to enforce. So hopefully that makes sense. The appendix can be adopted by jurisdictions, so it will be not required for anybody in Washington, except those jurisdictions that adopt it. So we've heard from a few jurisdictions that are tracking it. King County, and then other cities have been very interested in it, have showed up for meetings, and been interested in, well, how can we help? A lot of cities don't have the capacity to develop their own embodied carbon regulations, but this could be a unified approach for any jurisdiction in the state to adopt. So that's the number one. It's an optional appendix. The next thing is there are two main proposals right now. One is called, and they have, names not named for people to be able to remember them. One is called the BFRW proposal, and I had QR codes in my presentation, and it was a pretty good presentation, I'll say. And the second one is called the Anderson version of that, and that is my last name. So I'm going to go through the differences between those two, and then the commonalities between the two. So so here are the two side by side. So there's a BFRW one on the left, and this is lovingly called 24-GP1-118-R4_BFRW. And this is what passed the BFRW committee last year, and then was put by the council into the public comment process, which hasn't officially started yet. The one on the right is the Anderson version, and that is me listening to a lot of the complaints about the BFRW one from industry and making a few changes based on what I know as someone who's been on the Building Code Council for almost 8 years now to make it more easily adoptable. So I think both of them are good. And picking and choosing elements of either or both that are advantageous is probably what I would recommend. So the commonalities, they both have a way of looking at the code. They both require embodied carbon calculations to be on the permit documents. They both require the person who is stamping the permit documents to, since they're included in the drawings, to also stamp the calculations for the embodied carbon analysis, whether it's the materials pathway, the building reuse pathway, or the whole building life cycle analysis pathway. The idea here is that jurisdictions they have to train up every code cycle, and they will train up for IBC and a lot of codes and a lot of jurisdictions that are not large, that are not Seattle or Bellevue. A lot of the people there cover almost all the codes. within a single person, and they will not have the ability to learn embodied carbon on top of energy, on top of fire life safety, on top of mechanical, on top of ventilation, on top of, fire and all that. So this is intended to put most of the onus on the design professional that is stamping the drawings, be it an engineer, architect, or some other party. So that's a commonality between them. They both require that to be done during the permit documents, and then both of them require something to be done before a C of O, but that differs significantly between the two proposals. So we'll dive into the two proposals right now. So the one on the left is the BFRW one. This contains 3 pathways. So there's a product compliance. Well, okay. There's a product compliance pathway, which takes global warming potential, I believe, from the Carbon Leadership Forum baselines, 2023 or 2025. I don't remember which one. But anyway, the code would actually have these numbers in there, and you would include the product. So let's say you use 3,000 PSI concrete. Your global warming potential that you project you can get is 250. So you're a little bit below this. So then you'd multiply that by the number of cubic meters of that. And there's a spreadsheet that I unfortunately can't show you because I don't have it because it was in my presentation. That would then show you that you're saving, a couple tons of carbon right there. If you also had some CMU in there, you could compare that to the baseline here. Same with rebar, structural steel, structural wood, insulation, and flat glass. Those are the only products covered in the materials pathway. So it ignores lots of other materials like brick cladding or metal panel cladding or something like that. And what you need to do is show that all of your products in aggregate, when you add them together, are below the average for all of those same products. So every product doesn't need to be better than the baseline. But if you have a product that's worse than the baseline, you probably need to have a product that's better than the baseline by a certain amount. And it's multiplied by the volume or the quantity so that it ends up being, does your total tons of carbon below the baseline? So that's the materials pathway. And then, as I mentioned earlier, jurisdictions would be able to choose either 50,000 or 100,000 as a square footage of the building that would be required. And then they could also, for the product compliance pathway, decide if buildings should be 85% of the median, 90% of the median, at the median, or even 120%, meaning 20% worse than the median of all the global warming potentials in here. So there'd be a handy spreadsheet provided. So as the person putting together the building permit, all you'd have to do would be fill out what the anticipated EPD, industry average, or product specific is, and then add up all of those and show that you're below the median. Now, often we don't have EPDs selected in when we're submitting for a permit. So you'd have to choose an indicative one that's probably within your specifications to put in your permit documents, and then there'd be a check afterwards before the C of O. Then after that's the materials pathway. Then there's a whole building compliance pathway that requires a 60-year whole building BLCA, and you would in this one it would have to be 10% below there's 2 sub pathways within here. One is the absolute. You have to be below 500 kg CO2 per M2 with a 10% reduction, meaning 90% of that, or 450 kg per M2, or the relative reduction requirement where you're 90% below an equivalent baseline building that you would model as a baseline yourself. So that's kind of typical whole building life cycle analysis process. It's kind of like what LEED does. You can take credit for reuse and salvage and biogenic carbon explicitly within this particular version of it. The building reuse pathway is simple in some ways and you're retaining at least 45% of your primary and secondary structural frame and exterior wall envelope. And there's some caveats on here for things that are upgraded and replaced to improve energy performance. So those are the three pathways. I'm going to go to the Anderson proposal and talk about the pathway there. And then we'll get to how you show compliance at CFO. So for this version, all existing buildings are simply exempt. So there's no existing buildings pathway because you don't have to do anything if you have an existing building. You simply ignore this piece of the code. Or you write on there that you can ignore the piece of the code because you have an existing building. So it only applies to additions or new buildings greater than either the 50,000 or 100,000 threshold that the jurisdiction chooses which to adopt. There's only a whole building life cycle analysis pathway. So all of this material stuff was stricken. The reason for this is that some industries, and it's probably the wood industry, thought that their products were being penalized under the materials pathway. So they prefer only a single pathway being the whole building life cycle analysis pathway. And we heard a lot of complaints from wood, steel, and concrete about the materials pathway because each one of them felt that their particular product was being disincentivized by that, which in some is impossible for all of them to be disincentivized, but that was their opinion. There were some letters written. This is not, this was contentious. So I'm not going to say that it wasn't. So there's a whole building life cycle pathway under the Anderson proposal. That's the only pathway because existing buildings are exempt. And it also allows an option of using a software like EC3 that only calculates A1 to A3. And if you do that, you can use the Vancouver Embodied Carbon Guidelines to fill in the missing modules, the other A's and the B and the C, so that you can end up getting there. Because Vancouver, I think, also allows EC3 and has those factors in there. You also are explicitly allowed to include reuse and salvage. You're also explicitly allowed to include structural material optimization and material improvement. So it's a little bit more clear on what you can take credit for in this. So how does this happen? Let's see. Okay, so registered design professional at both of them is required to prepare the construction documents and show that it complies. However, so the BFRW one, the one on the left, you have to show by the end of your building that you actually comply with the percent reduction that the jurisdiction adopted. In the Anderson version, I felt that was a bit onerous, and I'm going to go a little sideways here and talk about the energy code. So in the energy code in Washington, which was one of the first jurisdictions in the country to adopt an air barrier test, a blower door test, where you basically pressurize a building or depressurize it and see how much air is going to leak out of it. When that was done, it was like 2009 or something like that. And the state of the industry in Washington was that no one had done a building over 5 stories. So we felt like you couldn't require it to pass the test. So for the first 2 cycles, Washington, the Seattle and then Washington only required people to perform the test and write a narrative about why they didn't pass, if they didn't pass. And that, you know what, almost all the buildings passed because the contractors were interested in doing a good job, and it brought this whole level of scrutiny to envelope details and sealing and all that. So almost all the buildings passed, and in fact, they passed much better than the minimum required because it was now a part of the code, even though it wasn't required that you pass. So the Anderson version takes that tack and says, okay, if you don't pass because the actual procured products were not compliant with what you said you might do under the permit document, it's okay. you redo your analysis based on the procured EPDs, but then you write a narrative describing why you didn't quite get there. So that's your get out of jail free card. That means nobody actually has to pass the first time, but as with the air barrier testing, it had a significant effect on the design and construction industry in that construction practices got better and there was a lot more scrutiny and a lot lower air leakage of our buildings, which is a huge energy savings. Whew. Okay, well, that's about all. I could talk for hours about this, but I'd rather go to questions and discussion.
Do you want to talk about the House bills at all? Are you prepared to do
The
that?
2273 or the what
Yes.
was that? Yep.
And I
So
think what I found is 2273 might have been last year's number. I think it got renumbered this year, but I'm not positive. So I don't know if anyone can chime in. I don't have that at my fingertips, but when I looked earlier.
So last year it was 1458. 2273, I believe, is yes, it's still 2273. Or it
Okay.
is. So what happened was it was refiled. So it's a Representative Dewar and executive session in the House Committee on Local Government, 10:30 on January 23. So it's coming up. So the bill, let's just look at it. And I've looked at it a lot last year because it had an opportunity to pass last year, but it was held up too long for it to actually get all the way through. So this directs the Building Code Council to do something, which is come up with something like the appendix that we have or that we are looking at, but it includes a statutory requirement of 100,000 square feet or larger. It includes the material reuse pathway of at least 45%, or sorry, building reuse pathway of at least 45%, and not adding more than 50% with an addition. It includes a materials pathway, and then it includes a whole building life cycle analysis pathway. And then it's the same attestation by the engineer or architect, and then it includes something looking to the future, saying the 2030 state building code would have to have a 30% reduction in embodied carbon from the 2023 material baselines or comparable industry standard. So in the first cycle, the State Building Code Council shall adopt building codes in the 2027 and 2030 code cycles that incrementally move towards achieving the 30% reduction of this, meaning the State Building Code Council has flexibility in 2027 and 2030 to say 2027 could be 10 or 15%, it doesn't matter. But by 2030 codes, you would need to be a 30% reduction from the CLF baselines to the 2023 CLF baselines. What this bill, it says nothing about the 2024 code cycle other than it would be product reporting only for buildings in the 2024 code cycle, which is exactly what we have in the appendix. So this would basically say the appendix that we have is largely fine because it's a reporting only bill. What other questions do you have about the bill?
Well, I guess I'll chime in because I see that Councilmember Arnold, Jay Arnold, mentioned that this bill has a public hearing tomorrow at 10:30. So I guess in my mind, I'm trying to think how all this fits together. I assume if this moves forward, then some of the options in the in the proposals you just talked about kind of go away because it has to be 100,000 square foot building. There's
Yep.
probably a few other things in there. I'm a little fearful that something, that gets passed is going to kind of not be the best approach that maybe what the SBCC was looking at. So, I mean, hopefully if people are testifying, these comments are kind of made apparent to the legislatures. And they're aware of all this work that went into the proposals. So anyway, I'll stop there and let others chime in.
I think to Micah's question, Micah is a former Building Code Council member, so it's good to see you, Micah. Yes, I think whatever the bill is largely unchanged from last year, and I think it would be modified. I would like to see it modified to align with some of the advancements in the BFRW proposal and the Anderson version of the proposal. I think we'd want those aligned with the bill if it passes. But so the fiscal note, as Micah suggests correctly, was what one thing that doomed the bill last year, which was that the state's facing a budget crunch and things that were not considered in certain buckets were just not going to be funded. This is to be completely fair, this is a very small amount of money that does a huge amount of lifting for the state. Nonetheless, it would be considered a new program. So it just people didn't feel like it would get the funding based on the fiscal note. Too expensive. So it has a chance this year. There will be hearings, so people can show up, support, oppose, go neutral on it. It's actually, if you haven't gone to the legislature and testified before, it's surprisingly easy. The hard part is that the meetings might be 2 hours long and you don't know when your bill is going to come up, and they might change it on the fly, like which bill is going to come up when. But you can look at the website and then show up in the right time, have it on in the background, sign in, saying that you want to say something, and then when your bill actually comes up, then you can tune in and put yourself on camera and testify. It's actually surprisingly easy in this Zoom environment.
Kjell, I don't know if you can answer. There was another question in the chat and why there was an exception for school districts.
I don't know. I saw a couple other bills this year that were just exempting school districts of certain sizes. There was one that exempted, let's see, what does it say in this particular bill? It says, except for school district, so it exempts school districts. Okay. I mean, if in order to pass it, school districts are exempted, so be it. I don't know why they would be exempted. I think there's some people that feel like this is going to add cost. I'll just go on the record in saying that, LMN does this on every project, the embodied carbon analysis, and it takes us, 10, 15, 20 hours to do an embodied carbon analysis. Can take up to 40 if we do it a bunch of times and use it as a design tool. But it's really a small number of hours compared to our overall design process. So we've just baked it into how we do business as a firm. So obviously there's education and training for firms that don't do embodied carbon analysis, but there's firms that are less than 10 people in the state that are doing embodied carbon analysis on most of their projects. So it's very applicable, and it's actually even more than the energy code. What we do, we specify as architects every material on a project, or at least it goes through us. So we should be aware of this. If we don't own it, somebody else is going to own it, and we'll just be cut out of another piece of our project's design. So we should really be owning our embodied carbon. Soapbox over.
Well, thanks for the presentation, both of you. I think it was remarkably well done without your slide deck in front of you. So Brian Sanford, I think, has his hand up. So why don't you Go for it.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Brian. I'm from actually from the Boston hub. I was invited by Michelle Lambert, and thanks for the presentation. I had a question for in your version of the proposal. Obviously one of the big changes is you kind of nix the materials pathway for compliance. And I'd just be curious why here in Boston we had a zoning amendment last year that kind of followed that sort of three pathways model. And I'm kind of curious, why you think that the sort of whole building analysis is the way to go. I probably agree with you, but I'm sure you've thought more about it than I have. So curious to hear more.
Yeah, yeah. It was not because I don't think the material pathway is a good pathway. I think it's a great pathway. It's a prescriptive, easy button pathway for anybody to go through. There was a lot of industry pushback about the materials pathway. And what I wanted was this proposal to at least go out to public comment and have a discussion on the materials pathway rather than it die because some people oppose the materials pathway. So it was more of the art of the possible than that I have any or have no love for the materials pathway. I think that's how a lot of people are going to want to. I think it's the easy button for how you get through this. But since it contains specific numbers, each industry thought their number was the wrong number. That's the simple reason why.
Great. That's super interesting. Thank you.
Do you see the other questions
There's
in the
a
chat?
question from Nazish.
I think
Or-
it's hi, Kjell. Something
Hi.
similar to what Brian asked, actually. So I think it does clarify to a point, but again, it's also, I think, a lot of projects that don't end up doing, a whole building LCA, at least that if they can bare minimum meet prescriptive requirement, which is less administrative work and more conversations with regards to maybe low carbon concrete or steel or like the big bucket items, we're kind of missing that chance. So um, kind of maybe not so good to hear, but that was pretty much my point. But I do have another question, which is if you had more clarity on the baseline modeling for embodied carbon, because a lot of the time, even in the whole building NCA that you do, maybe beyond just the CLF minimum average as a baseline, are there other like kind of details on how to define that?
Yeah, the answer I'll give is energy embodied carbon modeling right now is where energy modeling was 20, 25 years ago, where compliance with energy modeling involves a decent amount of faith and professional rigor. And there is no, we have ASHRAE 90.1, which tells us what a good baseline is for an energy model. We don't have a US or international standard for a baseline embodied carbon model. So right now it's, if you use whole building lifecycle analysis, you could use the one-click baseline, you could use the tally baseline, you could use a CLF baseline, you could use kind of whatever you want, and you can optimize in whatever way you want. And it's trying to get the muscle memory into the design and construction industry of doing embodied carbon. And as the baselines become more consistent, we can then require more rigor. So this is not intended to be down to a 5 or 10% accuracy. This is trying to get the industry to start adopting these practices as standard. And from that, then we can do more requirements around materials and baselines. That's a sideways answer to your question. So there are two proposals. So just because my version doesn't include the material pathway doesn't mean it's dead. It means that the public will get to comment on both options. And you could say, I like the Anderson proposal, but add the materials pathway back in. That's a fine comment, and I might even advocate for that. Micah, do you want to share your opinion on how code of issues would review and enforce this?
Thanks, Kjell. I really don't have an opinion on how they would enforce this. I do know that, as you pointed out in the original proposal at the state that I had a hand in with you and others to work on and create that language, so it is somewhat enforceable, is that the design professional is going to do the work, provide it to the building official, and they're just going to more or less sign off on your work. But I know that that will end up being more robust as the future process occurs. And there's not really clarity on how that will work. I know that in the state, there are already code officials that struggle to even enforce the Washington Energy Code just based on the complexity and time. And so I know that that's kind of the question. And a big part of that is the funding. You know, everybody knows we're in a housing and construction crunch, and with additional policies and additional needs like this or desires, then that's going to take away time and staff from other process. And are people going to be open to allowing an increase in permit fees to cover the cost to review and evaluate these for jurisdictions? Again, right now, as Kjell pointed out, this is going to be an appendix that could be adopted by jurisdiction. Seattle may do that. I know there's been a request from New Buildings Institute a couple years back for us to do that, but that was placed on hold. So I don't really have any answers, Kjell. I just know it's a lot of questions. A lot of code officials are asking that. So yeah, so that's kind of where I was at. Maybe to get your feel on that. I like
Yeah, I
your
guess.
revised, simplified version, by the way.
Okay, thanks.
That removes a lot of additional items. I still have questions on it, and that's why I mentioned the correlation between that and the new legislation, and hopefully you can work to modify some of the legislation. I was starting to type another comment in here that you had mentioned there's no U.S. standard for certain things, including the whole building life cycle item, but the legislation will tie you only to that ISO standard or multiple ISO standards, and maybe that's not the best path for the legislation.
That's a
We'll leave that open.
process. That's a process standard, not a like the baseline is 250 or something like
Sure.
that. So that's the little nuance in there.
Yeah.
But yeah,
some
so I
concerns,
expect
but
I think
thanks.
self-certification is becoming more prevalent or more popular. And I think this would be, go in that direction of, you have a design professional, you have a license, you are stamping something, the jurisdiction can review it and they can spend a lot of time or a little time on it. And, I think that's kind of the way that this would work. That's how I see it working. So some jurisdictions, like Seattle has people that only review the energy code and are really good and ask tons and tons of questions, and other jurisdictions don't. So, and this is a 100,000 square foot building, so primarily cities that have more specialty that would have this. And there's been thoughts of exempting certain like fruit warehouses or other things that might be 100,000 square feet, but, not the type of, the building where we're going to get lots of, sophisticated permit viewers necessarily, or lots of embodied carbon reductions the way you might in a, 500,000 square foot, high-rise apartment building or something like that. Anyway,
Thanks, Jill.
it's all open for
appreciate it.
public comment. So
Yeah, I know that code officials are going to have some, so I appreciate the involvement, of course. And I think the 100,000 square foot is a question I was asking or talking, not asking. Jess and I were talking about this yesterday, talking about the Oxford comma debate with the legislation and how the 100,000 square foot would apply. Is that if you said it wouldn't apply to existing buildings, but if you got an existing building and you're doing a rehab of 95,000 square feet of it, but the building itself is over 100,000 square feet, how does that then apply? And that's kind of some open question on the legislation and the appendix language as well.
Yep. I think the appendix in my version, you'd be exempted because it's an existing building. And I don't think we need to get at this point, this early date in embodied carbon in Washington, need to get into great detail about, well, are you saving 10% or 20% or 40% of the building or something? I feel like existing building renovation, exempt it, done. If you're doing an addition that's over 100,000 square feet, let's talk about that. So I feel like we don't need to split hairs at this point.
Yeah, I definitely like that. I hopefully we can see that in the modified bill because I think the bill previously had support. And right now that 45% number for existing buildings reuse is in there. So if you eliminate the pathway in the appendix and it's in the legislation, I think we're not correlating appropriately.
Yeah,
Thanks, Kjell. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Sure.
thanks, Micah.
Looks like we've got two more comments in the chat.
Is there a way to verify product manufacturer specific production pathways claimed in a whole building followed through construction? There is a way, but right now I think the embodied carbon, my thoughts on it are we should do a transparency only regulation at this point, where people do the calcs, figure it out, or they're below the threshold, and they try really hard to buy all those materials and all that. But if they don't make it, they get the C of O, the building goes fine. We collect some data on it, and they learn muscle memory of how to do it better next time. And eventually it would be required to meet a certain threshold. So there is a way to verify it, but I don't think we would do that in the first code cycle that this is in force.
Yeah. And I guess Aurora Jensen, are you part of CLF headquarters? I'm not clear. If you
Yes.
wanna...
Yes, I am. Hey, everybody. I recently relocated to the Seattle area, so I'm new to this group. But I lead the building side team at CLF, and in the chat, you'll see I shared a link to our survey for some of the programs and projects we're initiating this year, one of which it was in direct response to what somebody asked in this conversation about how to define baseline building. We're really looking for, technically minded people who have been in the weeds making those decisions on projects to help shape this guidance. We want it to be heavily driven by practitioners and folks that are doing this work every day. So we'd love to have you join that project or anyone else on the call who's interested. We also have 2 other projects in there, one about steel and one about multifamily residential projects. So please come join our conversations if you're interested, and nice to meet you all in the Seattle area.
Thank you. Adam.
Hey there. So I attended some of those building code meetings, and I had heard from some material industry representatives that they were arguing that the building code should not or cannot be charged with enforcing greenhouse gas emissions, and that they should focus on life safety and whatever was the charge that legislature set up when they established building codes. And then I heard they wanted to further that argument to ICC and kind of get that more straightened out in the national code process to kind of cap off any sort of manipulation through amendments that we're trying to do in Washington State with these 2 things. So my question to you, Kjell, is what would be a good statement against that? Like, can that hold water? Is that worth worrying about? Or, is that just a way to kind of throw chaff instead of focus on that option A with the material prescriptive approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think at the national level, we need advocacy for, this ability to regulate materials within the codes, including the embodied carbon of the materials. At the state level, we have this legislative mandate, 95% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050. There's no way we're going to do that without embodied carbon. So we're not going to do that without, operational energy use reductions, without electrification. There's a lot of things that go into that, but embodied carbon is one of the pieces. So my opinion is that this is aligned with that state goal.
Thanks.
I have no magic bullet though.
Micah, if you have a quick comment, I think we're at 12:59, so go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'd be happy to stick some video from the ICC hearings from this code cycle for 2027 codes. This proposal was brought forward there. It was G206. There are 2 videos for Committee Action Hearing 1 and Committee Action Hearing 2. I should let you know I was involved in that. I'm actually on the IBC General Committee for that. And for folks that don't mean, I'm City of Seattle SDCI's Technical Code Development Manager. But I'd be happy to put those in the chat if I can get it in there before things get closed off, if that's appropriate. But Adam, that might give you some information and others information on where that discussion went. There was a recommendation or several recommendations to not have this in the international codes, but look at it as either energy code policy or in a standards process for ICC. But again, I'd be happy to put those in the chat. Thanks, everyone.
That sounds good. And I know that there was a lot of discussion as well about just shifting all the embodied carbon to the IGCC. The reality is that not that many jurisdictions actually adopt the IGCC. And this is a problem that needs to be more widespread in the solution than the IGCC. And a lot of jurisdictions just don't want to touch the IGCC because it's kind of a codification of a bunch of things, which includes the embodied carbon, but not just embodied carbon. So I was on the side of putting it in the IBC, but anyway, thanks everybody. And feel free to email me if you have any further questions.
Thanks for joining, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you, speakers.
Thank you all.
Thank you.